I didn't realize that the people that we were dealing with were so intent on corrupting the process and covering it up. And I got to admit, I went in very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking that, if there is a violation of an election process or an election law, it was unintentional, and as soon as I bring it to their attention, they'll go off and fix it. No, I didn't realize that we were at war, and it's an ideological war, and it's an information war, but it is a war. And I think going into the 2024 election, I think there's a lot of people that understand that. And we're better prepared. We know what to look for. We know how they've stolen the elections in the past. And that part of the equation, I'm very confident we can do better on and get criminal complaints filed much quicker.
Welcome. Those who've joined us today came out of concern for their only state-granted unit of power over society. Many viewers remember when elections were much more straightforward. Ballots were once physical evidence that could have been used to typically promptly verify election result accuracy nationwide. Votes and vote processing started and ended with the ballots themselves. Fast forward to modern America, humans tallying votes has been replaced by a robotic process controlled by computer engineers. We merely take a leap of faith after filling out ballots and inserting them into voting machines by pretending that all the work done afterward is not manipulated by human hands and is free from security vulnerabilities. Complaining about election integrity is not as new as the Trump administration, but it would be difficult to learn that if reading or watching all of the propaganda put out by the government and mainstream media regarding election security. Democrats have also complained about security vulnerabilities in voting machines for many years. Just 1 year before the 2020 election, after it had newly become forbidden to discuss any possibility of election fraud, NBC broadcast a video explaining how easily hackable voting machines are, which is included in the documentation section on the webpage made especially for this interview, available on theveryright.com. Instead of screaming about the critical holes existent in America's election system, many past critics have newly been put back to sleep by propaganda about election integrity. In some states, apathy toward ensuring votes are being properly counted has been exacerbated by lawsuits and threats from incumbent governments. No state has seen such attacks on election integrity researchers more than Michigan, which, along with the Center for Internet Security, will be the main topics of this interview. Today, I'm pleased to welcome engineer, author, Michigan native, election security professional, and former Senator Patrick Colbeck. Patrick, will you please tell us more about your background, including when and why you started your quest to defend election integrity?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff. Appreciate it. Back in 2016, we had a presidential election while I was still serving in the Michigan Senate as vice chair of the Election and Government Reform Committee. And in the wake of that election, we found that one of my staffers was present at a recount called for by Jill Stein. And in that recount, she found a poll book that asserted that there were 306 votes cast in this particular precinct. Yet when you opened up the ballot box, there was only 50 ballots in the container. That's when we knew something wasn't quite right out in Detroit, and I called for an investigation into it. It led to an investigation conducted by our Michigan Secretary of State at the time, which was Ruth Johnson, a Republican. And she, just through data analysis, not through any serious or detailed investigation, this is just data intelligence efforts, she identified 31 counts of voter fraud. Those 31 counts were handed over to the Michigan Attorney General at the time, which was Bill Schuette, once again a Republican. And after an investigation by his office, there were zero prosecutions come out of it. So that kind of gave carte blanche to the scenario that was set up in 2020. And in 2020, I was no longer serving in the Michigan Senate. I served as a certified poll challenger with an organization called the Election Integrity Fund. And I was assigned to oversee operations out at the TCF Center, which is Detroit's AV Counting Board facility. And so I was there for the late night ballot drops at the back of the TCF Center without any chain of custody. I was there for the pizza boxes up on the window. I was prevented from going back into the room under some bogus COVID rules. And also, as a certified Microsoft small business specialist, I noted that all the tabulators and all the adjudicator workstations were actively online with the internet icon, very active. And so I started asking questions of election officials about why are these machines connected to the internet. They denied that they were connected to the internet. And I repeatedly asserted all you have to do is move that little mouse cursor and roll it over that bottom icon in your Windows display there, and it would say connected to internet, and they refused to do so. It wouldn't have affected any election results or anything else. And so that's when I started really getting ticked off, frankly, because I knew they were lying. I knew they were covering up something. And from that point forward, I've been investigating all the evidence that people have been sending me from all over the country around election fraud. And I currently serve as a chief operating officer for Lindell Management. And Mike has tasked me with specific operations around securing this upcoming election. So he hired me back in August of last year to do that. And prior to that, I was doing this all pro bono because I was so fed up with everything that they're doing. But the way
Amazing.
God works sometimes is that he takes care of those who are doing the right thing. And Mike hired me to essentially do the same things that I was doing for free prior to that.
Well, that's quite a story. You started out on your own because of the need. That's actually how I got into this whole thing, too. Somebody came to my door and told me that my lady voted twice in the election. So, yeah, it all hits home in weird ways.
I've had people knock on my door, too, but they had badges and they were attempting to intimidate me. So,
wow.
Around elections. Yeah. From the Attorney
Maybe we can
General's
talk
office.
about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start out with one of your specialties, the Center for Internet Security.
Yeah.
What is the Center for Internet Security? And is it censoring election-related information from voters?
Well, it's kind of a complicated subject, so I'm going to start with the basics. Back in 2017, the Secretary of one of the Deputy Secretaries in the Department of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, designated elections as a critical infrastructure sector for the United States. And when you designate a sector as a critical infrastructure sector, what happens is that you stand up what's called an ISAC Center, which is an information sharing and analysis center. Think of it as a big war room like you'd see in Dr. Strangelove or Austin Powers or something like that. It's actually the center of power for all the information related to that particular sector. So we have similar centers for, managing our gasoline infrastructure, our power grid, our food supply. But in 2017, they set it up for election integrity. So they formed what are called the EI ISAC Center. Now, the government can't manage that by themselves. So what they did is they contracted out with an organization called the Center for Internet Security to manage that facility. And I just want people to kind of, first of all, dwell and focus a little bit on the name of this organization that they hired to secure electronic voting systems that we're told are not connected to the internet. They hired a company called Center for Internet Security. And so if you want to understand why I get so fed up with all the lies, they're just nonstop and they're in your face. And here's a prime example. The Department of Homeland Security actually secures our electronic voting systems that we're told are not connected to the internet with a company called Center for Internet Security. And the important thing to note about this organization, first and foremost, is that it is a non-government organization. Why is that important? Well, I can't issue a FOIA request to a non-government organization.
How can they declare it critical infrastructure, but then hand it to a non-governmental organization?
Right, and what this organization has access to is quite remarkable, but this is kind of part of a bigger picture of who has access to sensitive election records and who doesn't. And what you'll find is that the people that are really running our elections are a bunch of NGOs. The people that have access to these sensitive election records are NGOs, which means they are not subject to FOIA requests, which is a major concern. I mean, if you really want to trust in the results of any election, transparency is the key. If I can actually see them counting the ballots and see people when they walk into the polling place, they're actually casting the ballots. I know who actually cast that ballot. I understand who they are. They provided some voter ID, so I know that they are who they say they are. That gives you much more confidence in the results of the election than having them managed by some third party or having the votes tabulated as you did in your opening by a machine. And I can't, as good as my eyesight may be at times, I don't have good enough eyesight to see inside of these computers and see how they're tabulating the votes from these ballots. And so for me, that is a concern. So this Center for Internet Security, the fact that they're a non-government organization sends off alarm bells right there. But here's the big deal with CIS. As working on behalf of the E.I. Isaac Center, what happens is that this Center for Internet Security has deployed what they call Albert sensors to county, state officials, and in some cases local officials in all 50 states across the country. And what these Albert sensors are essentially is internet traffic cops, ostensibly. They're there to monitor for malicious websites, malicious internet traffic coming into and out of the networks where our election systems are installed. And what's remarkable about that is that they're also getting access to that information remotely out at their respective data centers. And the headquarters for Center for Internet Security is in Greenbush, New York. I've heard from some people that they have a side facility out in Idaho as well, where they capture some of this information. The bottom line is all the information from all 50 states for all of our elections, our sensitive election records like voter registration data, poll book data, tabulation data, election night reporting data, it all goes through this organization before the public ever sees it in the light of day. And I think it begs some questions as to whether or not all this trust we're placing in this organization is warranted. And I think, when you actually dig into this organization a little bit more, you'll find out that I don't think that trust is warranted. And this is kind of a branch off into another one of the roles that CIS played and what the E.I. Isaac Center played, and that is in the control of information. So it's not just access to sensitive election records, but they are actually a central player in the misinformation, disinformation campaign being run in collusion with the federal government. And this isn't just former State Senator Patrick Colbeck talking about this. This is the United States Congress and their Weaponization of Government Committee. They issued a report on an organization called the Election Integrity Partnership. And that Election Integrity Partnership talked about and provided evidence in support of the federal government colluding with big tech, with big media, with what they call civil society, in the censorship and media manipulation of information of Americans in direct violation of the First Amendment. So that's an issue. And the fact that this same organization is at the heart of controlling sensitive election records, and they're also the ones that create what they call the misinformation reporting portal that tracks incidents that get flagged for censorship by all the big tech and social media and big media companies. That is a point of concern. And when you dig into the management team of the CIS, they're all former members of the Intel community, the same community that gave us the false narrative around the integrity of the Hunter Biden laptop, saying that was Russian disinfo. So for me, that's the big picture on CIS, why I'm concerned about it, why I think more Americans should be digging into this organization and understanding exactly why they have been given such a prominent, important role in the management of our elections nationwide.
Did the Center for Internet Security play an important role in the 2020 and 2022 elections by swaying the public's perception of the results?
There's definitely serious indications in what they call their JIRA ticket system, which tracks all these incidents. That suggests that they were deliberately um, flagging certain social media posts, if you will, as false information or misinformation or disinformation in some cases. And so you've heard of Twitter files. You've More and more people are learning about Facebook censorship regime. Well, a lot of the information around that came out of this investigation that was being performed by Congress. And I usually don't give a lot of compliments to the folks in Congress, I got to admit, but in this case, they've done an extremely professional report on it. And I encourage people to just go up to the Weaponization of Government Committee webpage, look under their reports, and read the document for yourselves. It's not just censorship of activities around the elections that you'll find up there. They were actually, through a very similar project to the Election Integrity Partnership, they had something called the Virality Project, which essentially had the same playbook, except it was addressing what they called COVID misinformation and disinformation. You know, like when people like me were telling people to use ivermectin, get early treatment, they would call that as misinformation, and who knows how many lives were lost as a result of their activities with this virality project. Well, it's the same cast of characters involved with both the election management of information and the COVID management. And there's a lot of other ties as well that I go into in my book about how COVID was used to actually cover up certain other areas of the election. But hopefully it gives a little bit better picture of how these guys play the censorship game. And they actually create in this JIRA ticket system that they highlight, which, by the way, you can get access to all the incidents that they've made public, at least, of how they flagged individuals around as providing misinformation, like President Trump, for example, and others like him. It's just, as somebody who took an oath to support the Constitution, it's for me to see what the federal government is actually doing in collusion with these non-government organizations is pretty remarkable and needs to be prosecuted.
Will 2024's election be any different, or any subsequent election henceforth, given the new status quo is allowed to persist regarding election information censorship and the new bureaucracy intended for preventing Americans from understanding what is happening?
That's difficult because they're the one thing we have to our advantage going into 2024 is that, unlike in 2020, where even as a poll challenger with that had served as vice chair of the Election and Government Reform Committee, I mean, I'm an engineer by background, aerospace engineer, so as part of that duty, I documented all the election processes. I knew how they were supposed to work. I didn't realize that the people that we were dealing with were so intent on corrupting the process and covering it up. And I got to admit, I went in very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking that, if there was a violation of an election process or an election law, it was unintentional, and as soon as I bring it to their attention, they'll go off and fix it. No, I didn't realize that we were at war, and it's an ideological war, and it's an information war, but it is a war. And I think going into the 2024 election, I think there's a lot of people that understand that. And we're better prepared. We know what to look for. We know how they've stolen the elections in the past. And that part of the equation, I'm very confident we can do better on and get criminal complaints filed much quicker. I mean, it literally took us 3 to 4 years to go off and coalesce this picture and put together cogent lawsuits, in part by design, because they're preventing the dissemination of this information. They're obfuscating FOIA requests for government agencies so that, instead of replying within 15 days according to statute, they're taking 9 months and forcing you to file a lawsuit in order to get the data. So they played the long game. They played the delay game. I think we're a little bit better spun up on that going into this particular election. And from a presidential election perspective, I think the strategy of too big to rig. I mean, anytime you look at the political landscape of what's going on right now, and you look at the raw polls that are going on, I believe President Trump is up 60-40 in all the critical areas and all critical states. So that creates one heck of a gap that they got to make up via fraud in order to be successful. And in support of that assertion, here's a little inside baseball. So somebody who was part of the leadership team, the Michigan Senate, Republican leadership team in the Michigan Senate. When you have a race that's within plus or minus 5%, that's where you put all your money. When you don't, when you're outside of those bounds, you start looking at other places to go off and put that money so you can make more effective use of it. And recently, the DNC and the Kamala campaign reallocated $25 million from her campaign to down ballot races. And that indicates that she's not within the plus or minus 5%. And I can tell you, there's no way in heck the worst candidate for president in American history, bar none, is more than plus 5% in that race. She's, I think, in bargain basement land regarding the polls. And so that gives me hope going into this upcoming election. So really it comes down to turnout and making sure, like the president says, that this is too big to rig. And if we do that, I think we're going to make it very difficult for them to get away with any election fraud.
I appreciate the optimism of that. As the creator of the newspaper of theveryright.com, I go through this every day. I watch the battles, the struggles, the losses, the victories. And I hope that we're there. We definitely see a lot of positive things. I would say last-minute positive things that I did not expect. So just throwing that out there as a bit of optimism.
I think there's going to be a lot more in October. Sorry. I think there's going to be a lot of good news popping out. It's kind of the way I'm wired as well, but I know a bunch of things that are simmering on the back burner right now that the ideal time for them to pop to the front burner would be now. And so I'm hoping to see some of that information come out.
Let's move on to our next subject here, voting machines.
Yeah.
A very popular topic when discussing election machines is internet connections. Mainstream media sometimes admit that the internet is used in order to transmit results, but breathlessly insist that the internet connection is both completely secure and only used at exactly the correct times. Can internet connections actually ever be secure in voting machines given all the smoke and mirrors surrounding their source codes and functionality?
It can never be 100% secure. Any IT professional, and I'm a certified Microsoft small business specialist, will tell you whatever your protocol is that you're using it, there's a way to spoof it. Even VPN tunnel protocol, where you have IP address to IP address with a zero trust system set up, you are still vulnerable to finding ways of spoofing that particular connection. And if you know what the endpoints are, you can spoof it. And so no, there's no way of securing those connections. I don't care if it occurs over a cellular data network. A lot of these machines have hidden cellular chips inside of them, installed inside of them. The ES&S DS200, for example, has a 4G wireless chipset. And most clerks, they don't even see this stuff. I mean, the only way you can find out that these things are connected to the internet is by popping the hood or popping the chassis on these machines, looking at their motherboard and having enough chutzpah and computer engineering experience to be able to say, that's a really large chip. I bet you it's an antenna-based chip that can be used for cellular communication. It takes a special kind of expertise to be able to identify that. And a lot of these electronic voting system vendors, are just pushing the marketing material that says, no, the systems are air gapped. You don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And they just buy it hook, line, and sinker, usually because state officials are telling them to buy it hook, line, and sinker, and they're the ones who've already bought it. So no, these internet-based connections are not secure. And here's a fundamental problem with networking of these systems in general. When you have a physical transfer of election records, say even if you put it on an electronic flash drive, a USB flash drive, you seal it in an envelope, you put it in that envelope. You have a Republican and a Democrat inspector sign off on it. Then you affix a seal on it. Then it's transported via via courier. That courier takes it to the next facility, checks to see, and then the people who receive it check to see that the seal is intact, and then they can have a magistrate or whoever's receiving it on the other end that actually certifies that there was no tampering with that record. With any electronic data transfer, there is no physical oversight at all of the integrity of that data transfer. And one of the most concerning aspects of a internet-based data transfer, digital record transfer, is that it's very subject to what are called man-in-the-middle attacks, where you think you're transferring data from point A to point B, but because these guys know that you're en route, it goes to point C and then gets modified before it goes to point B, and point B is none the wiser. And the Center for Internet Security is effectively a trusted point C in that transaction right now, which is a concern to folks like me who can't peek under the hood of their operations and find out exactly what they're doing. I do know for sure that these guys are able, per their agreements with these various government authorities all across the country, they are able to look at the decrypted state of the data, which means that the packets that are being captured in these internet transactions, they're able to take off all the security layers and peek inside the actual envelope and see what's in the package. And theoretically, they can modify that package before sealing it back up again and sending it out to whoever needs it. That's a concern. And so, no, any internet connectivity, you don't, and I want to make it clear, you don't need an internet connection to make our electronic voting systems vulnerable to malicious intent and modification of election results. I mean, as a case in point, the folks in Iran thought that their centrifuges for their nuclear program were isolated and air gapped, and there was no internet connection for those devices. Yet all it took was somebody to walk in and install a USB flash drive on their internal network, and bad things started happening to their centrifuges that they couldn't explain. So that's it doesn't, and you could program these tabulators to do the old Three Stooges count routine where they say 2 for me, 1 for you, prior to election day without even having to insert a flash drive. We've also got cases where all you have to do is modify the driver version on some of these devices and it becomes a Wi-Fi hotspot. So it's only limited by your imagination. And so for me, the designation of our election systems as a critical infrastructure component has a very special meaning, because as an aerospace engineer working on the International Space Station with Boeing, I was responsible for elements of our life support system. The astronauts tended to think of the life support system as a very critical infrastructure component. And the rigor we applied to analysis of all the different failure modes and the effects was significant, and nothing like that is done with these machines. We also had significant rigor in regards to configuration control, so that we knew that we had a specific software version, a specific hardware version that was installed at a given time and that was compatible in an end-to-end testing formation with all the other components it would interact with. So we were confident that it would work as intended when up in space, because we couldn't exactly call FedEx for a delivery while we were up there. And it had to work the first time. That's the attitude we need to be taking towards our elections, and we're not doing that right now. And so
there's even more lives at stake with the elections.
I agree. And there's a certain level of maturity that needs to be applied to the security of these systems that, frankly, I have not seen evidence of anywhere in the country. And I've looked, and I've had evidence and shared with me from all 50 states across the country, and it's concerning.
You kind of touched on this next question a little bit. Maybe you've already said what you wanted to, but is there any protection possible from USB drive or other data storage device abuse?
Yeah, get rid of the machines.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. That's literally the only thing we can do. It's all limited by your imagination.
Okay. Are there any other important potential voting machine vulnerabilities that you would like to discuss?
Oh, there's tons of them. So all right, first of all, I want to note that before November 3rd, 2020, everybody could talk about the problems and insecurities and security vulnerabilities associated with electronic voting systems. There are movies like Hacking Democracy, Kill Chain that were very prominent. We had all the Democrats that are now saying 2020 was the most secure election in American history. Um, they were all talking about these vulnerabilities and the ability of these machines to connect to the internet and be compromised through that. After November 3rd, 2020, I had to get on podcasts like this. In order to avoid censorship on YouTube, I had to refer to Dominion as Domino's, and I had to refer to ballots as pizza. So it was a very interesting little switch that just happened just because the election outcome appeared to be in accordance with what the people controlling the information wanted you to hear. So I guess there's tons of different vulnerabilities have been documented. I think one of them was in a court case in Curling v. Raffensperger in Georgia prior to the 2020 election, where a professor at my alma mater, University of Michigan, J. Alex Halderman, actually identified a significant number of critical security vulnerabilities in the Dominion ICX machine, which they use for accessibility for people that are hearing impaired, et cetera. And those vulnerabilities were sealed going into the 2020 election. Rather than fix those security vulnerabilities going into the election, they let the election go on, and then it took significant effort after the 2020 election to finally get that information unsealed and share it with people. And to Professor Haldeman's credit, he actually testified in a hearing, I think it was post 2020, where he went into the courtroom and showed how he could change the results of an election with a pencil. And by hitting the reset button on one of the tabulators, and it sets it up into reboot mode. And while it's in reboot mode, he can reconfigure it. And he altered the election results as a result. That's how easy it was. He did it in something like 5 minutes before the court, and everybody had been told that these are the most secure election systems in the world.
TheVeryRight.com covered that in real time, by the way.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. That you guys, that's important that people understand that. And then when people say, well, you can just review the ballot images and you can just review the ballots after it's all said and done. Well, I'm telling you, first of all, you need paper ballots. But if you're depending on ballot images, J. Alice Halderman actually had students at a DEF CON, which occurs every single year pretty much, where at DEF CON, they have a bunch of hackers going in and attempting to unsecure what they call secure voting systems and show how you can manipulate these systems. Well, his students went in and showed how in real time you could modify the scanned image of a ballot and flip the votes just by flipping the marks on a scanned ballot image. And so like I said, the ability to corrupt these voting systems is pretty much only limited by your imagination.
Excellent description. Dominion voting systems experienced a huge so-called error that even AP reported in Puerto Rico's primaries.
Yeah.
Here are a couple quotes from the article. The problem stemmed from a software issue that caused machines supplied by Dominion voting systems to incorrectly calculate vote totals. Machine-reported vote totals were lower than the paper ones in some cases, and in some machines reversed certain totals or reported 0 votes for some candidates. The incident even caused comment from Elon Musk, who urged the world to eliminate electronic voting machines. Do you have any comments about what was revealed?
Well, first of all, I want to make the observation that nobody could accuse Elon Musk of being a Luddite. And I worked on space program as well. I'm a certified Microsoft small business specialist. I'm not a Luddite either. I love technology. We're using technology right now for this podcast. That's not the issue. The issue is we want to prioritize integrity of our elections over convenience or perceived convenience, as the case may be. So yeah, Puerto Rico is just one example. I was in Antrim County, or not in Antrim County, but I was very familiar with that case and helping people out regarding that case, where they had a 7,060 vote flip in an election where about 16,000 ballots were cast. They flipped from Donald Trump to Joe Biden in a very, very heavy Republican county. And a friend of mine, William Bailey, filed a lawsuit in the wake of the election and sought an audit, a statewide audit of the election results, which was supposed to be guaranteed under a constitution, because something wasn't right there. And that was one of the first times we got to peek under the hood and see how these machines are actually configured to support elections. And what they found was quite remarkable. They found that everybody talks about you can't hack these because they're all encrypted data and nobody can get access to them. Well, they stored the decryption keys in plain text in the database on the server. So if they're stored in plain text, all you need is access to the database, which I'll tell you, for somebody used to deploy systems similar to this, enterprise level systems that involve SQL Server, most of the times the passwords are admin. In this case, I think Dominion's used the same password to get access to these systems since 2008. It was DVS Corp 08 exclamation point. It's changed now, I've been told, so I'm not giving away the secrets here, but that they use the same password across the board. And so there was no security there. They had non-certified software installed on it, SQL Server Management Studio. Anybody who's familiar with database management tools like this understand there's no place for this to be installed on a production version of an election system, because anybody with admin access to this particular tool that is not part of the certified list of software components identified by the Election Assistance Commission, anybody who has access to it can not only change the results of an election on the fly or via script, but they can eliminate any transaction log that would give away such behavior. So it's a very powerful tool, and it's in my home township of Canton Township out in Michigan. I know that they have the same software installed here. I also know that they have no firewalls active in our system at all with systems that are connected to the internet. So it's, I've done all the FOIA requests to validate all this information. They provided a firewall log that showed that all the software-based firewalls on the EMS server, which is the election management system server, the server that provides all the final election results that get certified, it had no firewalls, so no protection whatsoever. I mean, not even one port was closed. That is horrible practice, which highlights that I think we just do not have the maturity with the election officials or skill set necessary to implement these systems, which is why they outsource so much of our elections now to the non-government organizations. And we can't peek behind that curtain in order to see how they're conducting those operations. And when you do attempt to peek behind that curtain, like Mesa County Clerk Tina Peters did, they came at her with both barrels and prosecuted her without even letting her defend herself, saying that she was protecting and taking an image of her EMS servers just to preserve election records under her responsibility, which is a clear duty of the clerk. And they prosecute her because they don't want anybody peeking under the hood. As a matter of fact, if you look at the contracts that these vendors have with states like Michigan, you will find that there's an illusory provision in the contract. And what do I mean by illusory provision? Illusory provision is a provision that prevents anybody from discerning whether or not they're complying with the provisions of the contract. Typically, whenever that's brought up before a court, if it's not dealing with elections at least, that provision is thrown out and the court disregards it and says you can look at anything you need to in order to see if they're complying with the terms of their contract. But for election systems, they actually have these illusory provisions that prevent any analysis or examination of the machines and their configurations. So how do you know if they're complying with state requirements? I mean, you're going to trust them on the certification results. I've looked at the certification results. There is, once again, I've had my fair share of testing regarding critical infrastructure components. these are the wimpiest certification reports that I've ever seen in my life for a critical infrastructure component. So I don't have any confidence that they actually were meaningful at all. So I don't have that trust that maybe some other people that don't understand what should be done might have. So anyway, I could go on. And by the way, I want to make sure everybody understands it's not just Dominion. All these electronic voting systems have these issues. ES&S was called out for false advertising on some of their components, saying that they didn't have any internet connections. But like I said earlier, their DS200 machine had embedded, cellular modems on their motherboard that, unless you know what you're looking for, you're never going to know what's in there.
Excellent. So let's move on to our next part here, Michigan and lawfare.
Yeah.
What types of things did the government of Michigan do to fuel concern from Republicans and independents that it deliberately tried to sabotage its 2020 and 2022 elections to favor the incumbent administration?
Well, in my book, The 2020 Coup, What Happened, What We Can Do, I outlined 4 basic phases of the theft of the election. And the first phase is the preparation phase. And in this preparation phase, the whole objective is to create and expand existing weaknesses in our election system. And some of the biggest weaknesses that we have, obviously, are electronic voting systems, but also mail-in voting. Mail-in voting is inherently a third-party transaction. What I mean by that is that you as a voter are handing off your ballot to somebody that you trust is going to actually run it through a tabulator on your behalf and actually tabulate the vote on your behalf and report that vote on your behalf. And you don't see any of that stuff happening at all. It's all done by third parties that you have to place as blind trust in. And so in the lead up to the election, what we see is evidence of the incoming Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, who replaced the one we talked about earlier, which was Ruth Johnson, who was a Republican. Jocelyn Benson is a Democrat. She came in and she seeded the qualified voter file with 800,000 ineligible voters that had been previously scrubbed by the outgoing Secretary of State. And she currently serves in the Michigan Senate, and she sent a memo to all of her colleagues at the time saying, we need to conduct an audit of this voter roll because this is not right. And what having all of these ineligible voters in the voter registration file does is that it creates what are called kind of a low propensity voter resource pool, that anybody who wants to take advantage of this third party transaction called mail-in voting, all they have to do is find a ballot to marry to one of these low propensity voters. And once it gets inserted into a tabulator, you have no traceability as to whether or not that's a real voter who cast that ballot or a false voter, because there's a little ballot stub that gets torn off that connects that ballot and that the votes on that ballot to the identity of the voter. And we want secret, voting. We want to protect the integrity of secrecy of our vote here, and not just in Michigan, but across the country, because there's too many people that can weaponize that information against people. And just think about what would happen if somebody with Trump derangement syndrome, found out that one of their fellow board members on a high level, a Fortune 500 corporation board voted for Trump, and they would find a way to get rid of that person.
Yeah, it would just be harder to get a job in general after that.
Absolutely. And to that point, don't forget this, we have actually evidence of the people who are working on the theft of the 2020 election in Zoom calls plotting exactly that. They would actually go off and conduct simulations about what would happen after the election and how they deliberately wanted to target any Trump supporters with campaigns that would prevent them from holding any sort of public office, that would prevent them from earning a living for their family. And we're seeing that manifest in all the sanctions against lawyers, bar sanctions against lawyers like Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and Jenna Ellis and Stephanie Lambert out here in Michigan. They're trying to cut off in a form of lawfare, they're making sure that we have no lawyers to support our cases for election fraud going forward. Lawfare takes on a lot of other different forms as well. One of the ways that it was manifest in the 2020 election was that Priorities USA, which is a very progressive organization, decided to file a lawsuit, a friendly lawsuit against their friend, Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who's an outspoken Democrat, right? And they said, you know what, we're just not, our voter rights are just getting denied here in Michigan. And, you know, we got some problems here because you've got this Republican-controlled legislature. We still controlled the Senate and the House at the time. And so they didn't think they were going to get any of their quote-unquote reforms enacted via the legislative pathway. So what they did is they filed this lawsuit and said, Jocelyn, we need your help. You know, we're gonna name you as a defendant, but really, we're looking for you to use this lawsuit as an excuse to modify the rules and around verification of signatures when it comes to these mail-in ballots, because we want every ballot that gets submitted to be counted, whether or not it's a valid signature or not. And so we need you to relax those signatures. And so in order to get that lawsuit, quote unquote, dismissed, she decided to go off and relax the signature verification requirements for mail-in ballot applications. And so she was later found in violation of the law, but that court decision didn't happen until March of 2021, which is after a certain individual took over the keys to the White House. So they know how to play the long game on these. They know how to play the lawfare game. So they use the court system to enact a legislative reform that they didn't have the authority to go off and do at the time because they didn't control the legislature. And so lawfare, like I said, takes on many, many different forms. I've had threats, personal threats against me by companies like Dominion for talking about their Domino's and pizza that's out there. But I'll tell you, I'm just relaying information that's captured in their own contract with the state of Michigan for the most part, and it's pretty clear. Anybody who really wants to do some digging in on this, just read the contracts of these vendors with the respective states, and you'll understand they're designed to connect to the internet. Their vulnerabilities up the yin yang. There's very little configuration control. The requirements instituted by the state are lax and not commensurate with what I would deem a critical infrastructure component. There's a lot of concerns with how those are managed. And anyway, there's so many different paths we can go down in this lawfare part. But, you know, we're trying to get savvy to that going into this 2024 election and actually start engaging on offense regarding, you know, using the legal system on our behalf, not just in a defensive posture like we've been forced to for the first 4 years or so. But I got together with 3 current state representatives, Representative Jim DeSanta, Representative Steve Carra, and Representative Neil Frisky, and we filed a criminal complaint against the CEO of Dominion, John Polis, for perjury in his December 15, 2020 testimony under oath with legal counsel present before the Michigan Senate Oversight Committee. And we cited evidence in support of at least 15 counts of perjury committed by the Dominion CEO. And why this is important is that this testimony served as a foundation for a report that came out later in 2021 from the same Michigan Senate Oversight Committee that asserted that there was no problem with the 2020 election. And they used his testimony, his perjurous, I would assert, perjurous testimony as the basis for many of the assertions in their Senate report. And obviously that report's been parroted all over the media and a lot of court cases across the country whenever they want to go off and push the false assertion that the 2020 election was the most secure election in American history.
What a most laughably statement anyway. It's unbelievable that anybody would ever claim that.
Yeah.
What has the government of Michigan been preparing for the 2024 elections to make it harder to investigate voter fraud?
I'll tell you, they've at every branch of government, they've been very aggressive at systematically dismantling any oversight and transparency regarding the conduct of our elections. And I know that's a strong statement, but it's supported by the facts. Um, First of all, we've the Democrats effectively passed legislation that effectively outlawed poll challengers in the state of Michigan. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, did they say that poll challengers are banned? No. But here's what they did do. They put into law that a poll worker who felt like they were intimidated by a poll challenger, and they could cite them for a misdemeanor of intimidation of an election official. And the second time a poll challenger would do that, it would be a misdemeanor. The third time it would be a felony. And I don't know if you've ever served as a poll challenger or a poll worker, but if you're a poll worker, you don't want to be challenged by somebody who's telling you that you're doing the wrong thing. You're not obeying the law. You're not following an approved election procedure, whatever. So you're always going to be intimidated by somebody telling you you are doing it wrong. That's just the way it works, and particularly the way it works in contentious cities like Detroit, where poll workers are instructed to think of poll challengers as the enemy. They've actually got undercover videos of poll workers designing their work area specifically to prohibit oversight by poll challengers. They deliberately treat them as the enemy. So this isn't inconsequential. Furthermore, the Secretary of State has invented a new rule, that all the poll challengers must submit all their challenges to a completely new role called a poll challenger liaison. Instead of talking directly to the poll workers or poll inspectors, they have to chase down this mythical beast called a poll challenger liaison and submit all the challenges through that individual. And that individual has been given the judicial authority, effectively, to determine what is a permissible challenge and what is an impermissible challenge. And the guidelines around that are very light and loose, suffice to say. So even if a poll challenger manages to conduct themselves in the most polite manner possible and finds one of these liaisons, and they have a very valid challenge to an individual voter, they may or may not get that challenge admitted into the poll books as part of the election record. And historically, that's been important because canvassers were allowed to look at the poll books to go off and see if there's any explanations for any unbalanced precincts that might occur when they're reviewing the records prior to certification. So yet another one of the changes that Democrats have pursued now is to actually restrict that authority or access of the canvassers to that poll book data. They've passed laws that says, nope, they can't look at all that data. They got to make their certification decision solely on the basis of the statement of results, which is essentially a count of the ballots that have been put forward and the number of voters that were issued ballots for that particular precinct against the number of ballots that were cast. And then, of course, the vote tallies associated with the ballots. That's all they can look at now. So they have no investigative authority whatsoever.
They don't have to check their math.
Yeah, so the system essentially has been completely rigged. It used to be, I've still got my 2020, canvasser handbook, and it talks about some pretty broad investigative authority for the canvassers, and that's gone now. They're essentially intended to be a rubber stamp. When you couple that with all the efforts right now that they're doing to restrict data available to FOIA, I'll give you another example. We've been highlighting the importance of tracking UOCAVA vote registrations, and UOCAVA is uniformed not only military personnel, but overseas personnel as well. And about 2/3 of UOCAVA voters are non-military families and individuals that have just expatriates living overseas somewhere. And Democrats are seeking to get out the vote with these UOCAVA voters. And obviously, I want to support all military guys getting and their families getting an opportunity to vote. There's no doubt about that. But what they're doing now is going over people that say, I don't want to live in the United States and get them to go off and cast votes. And we're trying to track that information with the data that's typically provided in the qualified voter file, which is our voter registration file in Michigan. We used to be able to have a little field that's called UOCAVA. It would talk about their UOCAVA status. It would have a different designator for whether or not they're military, non-military, etc. Well, they're taking out that information. They no longer provide that via FOIA request because we started complaining about it and wanted to investigate it. They also, in the wake of the 2020 election, we conducted a lot of canvassing to validate the voter history data. Who vote? Did you actually? It says that you voted in the election. Did you actually vote? And if so, did you vote absentee? Did you vote in person? Well, now the Secretary of State has removed the field called voting method that allows us to determine that. So now we can't perform a professional audit that says, okay, at the end of day one for early voting, we know that there were 200 ballots cast, and we know that there were 200 voters who came in for that. I can't do that matching anymore. I have to do it now at the aggregate level for that precinct and say the sum total of absentee voters, election day voters, and early voters equals X. So they're deliberately obfuscating the audit trail for our elections. So there is no good explanation for any of this. It's deliberately done to make sure that we have less and less transparency and less oversight of the conduct of our elections, which is in direct violation of our constitutional rights defined in Article 2, Section 4 of the Michigan Constitution, which says that all interpretations of the provisions of our election rights are supposed to be liberally construed in favor of voter rights. They're not doing that. They're doing the exact opposite.
If viewers want to know more about the obfuscation of the status of the vote, the second interview that I did with Fani Montravati of checkmyvote.org discussed that.
Yeah, Fani's been great on that. He's a great person to talk. He's the one that's been discovering it along with Tim Vetter. Both of them got together and formed Check My Vote. Those guys are great, what I call meddling kids. Those are the folks that are investigating election fraud, even though it's not their job, just like the old Scooby-Doo characters used to do. They used to do the job of law enforcement and ended up discovering all the bad guys' schemes. Well, that's what people like myself and Fani and Tim and yourself are doing all across the country. We're poking our nose where they don't want us to be poking our nose. And at the end, I'm looking forward to that unmasking where the criminal says, and I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
Exactly. And a lot of people get frustrated about the fact that it's hard to talk to people about this. But in reality, if such a thing is going on and we are going to eventually unmask, then that means the glory is just off the charts for the people who stuck with it the whole time and were told that they were wrong and that they didn't have evidence.
There's not a lot of people feeling glory right now, obviously. Tina Peters.
Well, eventually it'll come. We'll unmask. The meddling kids will win.
But we've got all these January 6ers right now that are being held without trial. We've got Tina Peters that's being charged. We've got lawyers that are losing their source of income. So I get it when people are a little frustrated by that. I'm frustrated by it myself on it. And don't get me wrong, I am hopeful in the truth coming out for sure. But I can understand why people are a little frustrated on the journey right now.
Absolutely.
I would rather be doing anything else with my life except investigating election fraud.
People think that we like politics, and that's why we do it.
I can't stand. I mean, I wrote another book called Wrestling Gators, talking about how government really works. I can't stand politics, but I want to. The people that want to subvert the integrity of our elections, who want to control our lives via government, they prey upon people that want nothing to do with government.
Mm-hmm.
And
sadly,
so if you decide to stay out of government, nature abhors a vacuum, they're more than willing to fill that vacuum and leverage that power to make your life frickin' miserable.
And that's also the whole point in explaining to others, if they're just going to end up feeding the problem, then everything that good people do in this world just doesn't end up meaning anything at all. So we have to continue the fight, even if it seems uphill at times.
Yeah.
I've got a question here. Secretary of State Benson is now straightforwardly threatening all local election officials who may be decent enough to not want to certify obvious fraud. Is that normal behavior for a Secretary of State, or is it simply highlighting what many are already reading between the lines about election integrity?
Well, obviously the latter. I mean, she's behaving like a thug, somebody that's an official in a banana republic. And what she's doing is attempting to threaten canvassers that refuse to certify fraudulent elections. And here's the dirty little secret that she's not telling any of these canvassers is that if they refuse to certify elections under current Michigan law, all that happens is that those election records from the county go up to the state and they go off and perform an investigation into the veracity of those election records. There is a law that was passed by the Democrat House and Senate and signed into law by Governor Whitmer that did not receive immediate effect until so that it will not go into effect until after the 2024 election. It doesn't go into effect till end of March next year. That would effectively force county canvassers to certify a presidential election if the unofficial vote results showed a statewide vote margin of less than 25,000 votes. So I think they're thinking that it got immediate effect. It did not. And so we have one more election for these county canvassers to say no to fraudulent election results. But in order to prevent that from happening, they're threatening them. And it's not just the Secretary of State. It was the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, did it 2 weeks before the Secretary of State did in a tweet. And here's why they're doing that. Here's why they're forcing them and threatening them to certify the election results. Because this is another dirty little secret, is that the 2020 general election in Wayne County, Michigan, was never lawfully certified. And if you take out the Wayne County election results in the statewide election results, it puts in a much different light the case against these 16 Republican alternate slate electors that have been prosecuted by the Michigan Attorney General. Because if you take out the results from Wayne County, the lawfully certified election winner in 2020 was Donald Trump, not Joe Biden, which means that the Democrat electors were the ones that fraudulently submitted their names to the slate of electors. So this is a big deal. And by the way, I know it's a big claim. It's a bold claim to go off and say that. When the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, charged those 16 electors, I said, this is ridiculous. The only way these charges hold any water is if you could lawfully assert or genuinely assert, truly assert that the 2020 election was lawfully certified. If it wasn't, then the idea of an alternate slate of electors is perfectly valid, right? And it's perfectly valid in any case, but this makes it even more clear, frankly. And so I was there when the Wayne County Board of Canvassers considered whether or not to certify the election results. They voted no on the certification. And after they voted no, I took off, went back home, had a meeting. I figured everything was all said and done. Found out 2 hours later, the meeting was still going on. Turns out that during public comments, there were quite a few racial slurs made against Monica Palmer and William Hartman, who are the Republican canvassers, for not certifying the elections. And they felt threatened. They felt intimidated. And they sought a compromise solution with the Democrats. And they said, you know what, if we can get an audit of these key precincts that are obviously fraudulent, then we're willing to do a conditional certification of the vote. So they came back and did a conditional certification of the vote. And then right after they did so, the conditions that they called for, which is the audit, the Secretary of State says there's no way in heck we're going to do an audit of that. And so the condition was invalid, which means that their vote was invalid. But even if you don't take that approach, I can get all Robert's Rules of Order on you with the way that official proceedings of meetings are supposed to proceed. There was no reconsideration of the initial vote to vote no on the certification. And under Robert's Rules of Order, that means that the first vote is a rule of record. And by the way, in case that's not enough, after they got home, the next day they went off and filed an affidavit reasserting their no vote. And so in the wake of the Michigan Attorney General filing charges against these 16 electors, I decided to go off and issue a FOIA request for the official certification records for Wayne County during the 2020 general election. And I got back the actual certificates, and you can see it up on my website at letsfixstuff.org. the actual certificates were missing the requisite Republican signatures that are required under MCL 168.24E, which means that the certification never took effect, because in order for any action by the body, by the Board of Canvassers to take effect, it had to have at least one Republican signature on it. And so that's all backed up by the fact that they reasserted their no vote and everything else. So it's valid that Wayne County was never lawfully certified. And by law, the state election results can only be certified by the State Board of Canvassers on the basis of certified county results. That's it. So that's a big deal. And it hopefully provides a little bit of context for your listeners as to exactly why Jocelyn Benson is threatening the county canvassers and why Dana Nessel is threatening the county canvassers. This is a big deal. And I just want to make sure any county canvassers that's out here that's listening to this, and anybody who knows a county canvasser, make sure they know the truth. The truth is they can vote no if they suspect fraudulent election in their particular county. All that happens is that the election records get booted up to the state for consideration. That's all that happens. So, and you can look at the whole analysis once again up at letsfixstuff.org. And I provide all the references, all the statutes, everything, and including the affidavits by the Republican county canvassers as well. So there's no doubt in my mind 2020 was never lawfully certified in Michigan, which means that the 16 electors that were awarded to Biden from Michigan in the 2020 election actually belong to Trump.
A Project Veritas voter fraud expose recently showed systemic fraud in Hamtramck, Michigan. News that even intruded into the political left's echo chamber because of the Democrat voters affected. Do you have anything to add about how fraudulent absentee ballots were being used to subvert the Muslim Democrats inflamed by the war in Gaza?
Yeah, obviously there are a lot of pressure tactics being applied there. Yet another reason why we need secret ballots. We need to preserve the ballot secrecy, because you can have these ballot parties, kind of like unions conduct card check parties, where they make sure that you're voting the right way before you're allowed to leave the door of the auditorium where they're distributed. This is the stuff that happens out in the back rooms and dark rooms that people don't want to acknowledge happens. And the Project Veritas, I'm just so thankful that they expose this. This is kind of our ace in the hole coming into the 2024 election. There's a lot of Democrats that are principled, that understand that their candidate never received any primary votes in any state that leading into this election. She was essentially selected by a group of delegates to their national convention without a vote of the broad people at all. So they haven't had a chance to express their voice, which is ironic because they're called the Democratic Party, and there was no democratic process in the designation of Kamala Harris as their candidate for this upcoming presidential election. There's a lot of people that are ticked off at that, and this is on the heels of the whole superdelegate fiasco in the 2016 election that kept Bernie Sanders from being the nominee for the Democratic Party in favor of Hillary Clinton. So there's a lot of people in the Democratic Party that are getting upset with the way the Democrats are conducting their elections. And I have a sneaky feeling we're going to have even more whistleblowers in 2024 than we ever had in 2020.
It's going to be hard not to, because of all the work of the pioneers. At this point, the 2020 people were the pioneers, and we're about to step into their new frontier. Will you please comment on the ongoing news regarding GBI Strategies getting busted in October 2020 in Muskegon, Michigan, where what was seemingly a mail-in ballot application factory linked to nationwide similar stations was discovered by Michigan law enforcement and then quickly buried by Attorney General Dana Nessel?
Yeah, first of all kudos go to one of our fellow meddling kids, Keith Henkel, out on the west side of the state. He actually issued a FOIA request for the police reports associated with this because it popped up and disappeared, after the election, and he wanted to find out what was the disposition of this court case. So he issued FOIA requests, and what was discovered, and mind you, I think it's very important people re-listen to what you said regarding the timing. This was in October of 2020, before November 3rd, 2020 election, that an alert clerk in Muskegon identified that somebody was submitting over 10,000 absentee ballot applications with her office and with what appeared to be the same signature in many cases. So that's fraud on the face of it. And she cited that incident to local police in Muskegon. They started investigating it and went up the chain to state police. State police handed it over to FBI. And the FBI, like they've done in all too many cases in recent years, it appears that the FBI served as the cleaner crew in organized crime lingo. They come in at the tail end of an investigation to clean up all the evidence and make sure nobody has access to it. And that appears to be what happened in Muskegon with the GBI Strategies probe.
They're metaphorically spraying off the rooftop.
Yeah, exactly. Harkening back to that first assassination attempt against President Trump. And same thing that they did in Koenig. I thought it was a big deal that the LA County prosecutor was charging the CEO of Koenig for sharing sensitive election information, PII information, with the Chinese Communist Party overseas. And little I realized that he was just doing it to keep other people from getting access to that information and then later scrubbing that data. So that's been kind of the modus operandi, unfortunately, for the FBI. I used to be excited that they would get involved and start an investigation. Now, I hate to say it, I just realized, I just look at it for what it is now. They are effectively the cleaner operation that goes in and makes sure that nobody has access to this data, and their job is to put it to bed.
It's a monopoly over crime.
Yeah, it's once you start looking at this as an organized crime syndicate, it all starts making sense. If you recall, in Al Capone wasn't brought down by regular law enforcement. They weren't brought down by the FBI or anybody like that. He was actually brought down by the IRS, a Treasury agent.
That tells you a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What battles are you personally fighting in court right now?
There's quite a few. Obviously, I'm helping in the defense of a lot of these lawyers that are being sanctioned by providing data in support of their defense. I'm supporting the various legal teams for the 16 electors that are being falsely charged by the Michigan Attorney General. I'm supporting, obviously, Mike Lindell and his efforts to exonerate himself for a lot of lawsuits that have been filed against him. And in Michigan, there's a couple lawsuits that are active right now that I'm supporting. And I don't want to disclose all the people that I'm supporting because I don't want them to be unduly targeted, if you know what I mean, in this environment, because I'm kind of the lightning rod for certain individuals in state government right now. But
Proudly.
I'm involved in at least 4 lawsuits that I'm currently. So there's a lot going on.
Thank you for all the effort, by the way, that you're putting into this.
Oh, I've learned so much more about our judicial system than I ever knew when I served in the Michigan Senate, and I served on the Michigan Senate Judiciary Committee. So I'll tell you, if I knew then what I know now, there would have been quite a few different bills introduced by me during my tenure in the Michigan Senate.
Very interesting. Now we're wrapping up here toward the conclusion. I've got one final question before I ask you if you have any concluding thoughts. Did third-party candidate Jill Stein's campaign already win Americans the right to examine voting machine source code?
Well, I would submit we always had that right. Okay. And in Michigan Constitution, it's pretty clear. We have rights as citizens to audit statewide election results, and that includes those records. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer, and I don't need Jill Stein to affirm that right for me. But sure. Jill Stein's investigation did backfire in one key area, is that it woke me up to what was going on with our elections. And in the wake of the 2016 election and wake of the investigations on that identified those 31 counts of voter fraud in the 2016 election, I teamed up with folks like Catherine Engelbrecht out at True the Vote. And we were all ready to go off and conduct a hearing on the integrity of our elections. But we found out that our Senate Majority Leader at the time, which was Arlen Meekhoff, who's a Republican, refused to allow me to have that hearing because he thought it would give me too much press because I was running for governor at the time too. And I can assure you, the reason for the hearings had nothing to do with running for governor. It had everything to do with the fact that we had 306 ballots per the poll book and 50 ballots in the container. We had to get to the bottom of that, and we had 31 counts of voter fraud that were not being prosecuted. So I was a little upset, suffice it to say, that he prohibited the chairperson, who is Senator Dave Robertson, from actually conducting that. And frankly, I'm a little upset with Senator Robertson because he could have still ignored the Senate Majority Leader and conducted the hearing, and he didn't. So that underscores the fact that the issue with our elections has nothing to do with political party. I mean, there is seriously a uniparty, and I'm saying that as somebody who served as a Republican state senator for 8 years. There are people that have R's and D's next to their name that have the same objectives, which is to control the thoughts, perceptions, and policies of our government, and control the thoughts and policies and perceptions of the people under that government to their own benefit. And I'm sick and tired of it. And what we're really, fighting right now is that existential battle for freedom versus control. And these guys aren't loosening up on their grip very easily at all. The whole Republican Party here in Michigan is, and which is occurring elsewhere in other states. I know from discussions with people all over the country, there is a lot of schisms right now, even on the Republican side, around this topic of elections, because there are people that refuse to believe that there's anything wrong with our elections. And the ones who refuse to believe that are usually the ones that are in control of the current system.
The ones counting the ballots.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of machine-based manipulation actually started with a Republican congressman in Florida. At least that's the earliest known count of that happening. He asked a Democrat programmer by the name of Clint Curtis, to actually write him a program that he thought was there to provide verification and validation of the election results. It turns out that he was actually providing him a tool that could be used to manipulate the results.
Which year was that?
2002. It was right in the wake of
right when they
the dangling
first started coming out.
Yeah, and so the whole push. I mean, if you really want to get your conspiracy hat on, the whole push for HAVA, which is the Help America Vote Act, that gave rise to electronic voting systems all across the country, gave rise to the Election Assistance Commission, and a lot of the federal guidelines regarding the use of electronic voting systems. That came in the wake of that 2000 election of Bush v. Gore.
Exactly. I've told people that for a long time. I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Well, and here's the core issue with electronic voting systems in general, is that they effectively allow the centralization of the management of our elections, which is why it's appropriate we kind of end where we began and highlight the role of this Center for Internet Security that had access to data in a centralized data repository for all 50 elections across the country. So if you're wondering where the call comes to shut down elections at the same time in battleground states all across the country, somebody had to be operating a control room, seeing that data all at the same time with access to it to say things ain't going the way we want. We got to stop and recalibrate the results so we can get the results that we want. And these electronic voting systems, which are not subject to oversight by you and me, because I can't see them counting the votes like I can with a hand count of an election. This centralization of management means that you need fewer and fewer people that are in the know about the theft of an election, which means that it's less and less likely to expose it. And so, when we talk about all this stuff, we always got to remember the most important thing about our elections is that we're able to trust the election results. It's the integrity that matters more than anything else. I don't care if it takes 3 months to count the election. I want to make sure that they're accurate. And by the way, as it turns out, there's this big PSYOP campaign that's trying to convince us that it takes too long to count via hand counts, and we need these machines. I got news for you. We used to count by hand all the time before the machines. We used to know how to count before Common Core math got into our schools. It wasn't a big deal. But so don't believe the rhetoric. I'm telling you right now, it costs 10 times as much to go off and conduct elections with electronic voting systems. And for that cost, you introduce all kinds of the voting system vulnerabilities, security vulnerabilities that we talked about, and you don't gain any efficiency in time spent or anything like that. So it begs the question, why are they pushing it? And I think it gets to the heart of the centralization of the management of our elections.
Excellent. That was a pretty good summary in itself, but do you have any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, ultimately, I want people to be focused on transparency in the conduct of our elections and join me and others in pushing for increased transparency and oversight of our elections, so that we can actually verify the vote count, so that we can actually verify the eligibility of voters, that we can verify whether or not somebody voted or didn't vote in a given election. We don't care how they voted. We care whether or not they did vote, so we can tell whether or not it was a ghost voter or a real voter. Because what's the primary mechanism people use to determine election integrity nowadays? It's a recount, right? They say, well, if you count the ballots and it all adds up to the right number here, then you can trust the results. Wrong. You need to look at the entire election record chain of custody. You need to have transparency around the entire election record chain of custody, because when you conduct a recount, I don't know how many of those ballots I'm looking at are counterfeit or real. I don't know how many were cast by real voters or fake voters. I don't know how many were cast in the name of a real voter, but they didn't cast that particular ballot. So I just ask everybody to just join us in that push for increased transparency. If we have increased transparency, then we can start having faith in our elections once again. Unfortunately, the trend line right now in states like Michigan in particular, the trend line is towards less and less transparency, less and less oversight. We need to push back against that. And once we do, we can start having confidence in our elections again, and I can move on to something else with my life besides looking at election integrity.
Exactly. Make sure to check out Patrick Colbeck's letsfixstuff.org for his latest articles. There you will find his book, The 2020 Coup, What Happened, What We Can Do, and also letsfixstuff.org gear. Patrick, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Great job on the research and prep for the show and everything. You're obviously schooled up on all this data very well, and I appreciate it. We need more people digging into this stuff so we don't lose our country.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.